Welcome to The Link, highlighting entrepreneurial paths with U Ottawa alumni from around the world. Listen in to hear how people from a multitude of backgrounds have made their ideas and passions come to life. We'll explore the steps they took, the issues they overcame, and their lessons learned. My name is Sharon Wong. I'm a University of Ottawa alum who does marketing consulting for both startups and corporations, and your host for this series. Philippe Deschamps has 29 years of experience in the health sciences industry. He served as the Director of Neuroscience Marketing at Bristol Myers Squibb, CEO at GSW Worldwide, and was the founder and CEO of Helios Medical Technologies. Phil has a BSc in Chemistry from the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Phil. So happy to have you on The Link today.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. It's nice to be with you today.
The health tech industry is booming right now. Your career has been focused in neuroscience, healthcare commercialization. Can you tell us how you got interested in that?
Well, the deep interest is one that's very personal. For whatever reason, everybody has different genetics. My family has been affected by neurological conditions and mood disorders, and for whatever reason, Sharon, touch wood, my DNA has been bypassed. Yet that my family has suffered greatly. So I always had a very deep interest in this area. I wouldn't say that it sort of inspired me to start my career, but once I was in it, I certainly sort of defaulted to the kinds of things that had to do with the brain. So all the way back to when I was at Bristol Myers Squibb, if I had a choice to do the cholesterol drugs or the antidepressants, I chose the antidepressants kind of
thing. What a great area to be in, and what a meaningful reason to be in it too. So you founded Helios. Indeed. Can you tell the listeners how Pons came about and the inspiration behind it?
Sure. So this is a really great story, and it's a story that can only really be told in one direction, from how we were exposed to it and how it came together, because you couldn't really invent those circumstances. But what I think is a really important message for how this was created is for all the listeners out there, just to keep a very open mind. And to take calculated risk, especially when it sort of takes you out of your little comfort zone. So this is a kind of a funny story. Some of your listeners may know Montel Williams. So he's well, maybe not, because you're perhaps a little bit younger, but Montel was a radio and talk show guy, an Oprah Winfrey-like person, but not on quite the same scale. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2002, and he became an advocate for people with MS, and started to look for anything that might help him. And for most neurological conditions like MS or Parkinson's or things like that, unfortunately, there are just no symptom. There's no cures, certainly. And even controlling symptoms was really difficult. And Montel was introduced to me by a mutual friend to do something completely different, to write a business plan on the Affordable Care Act, of all things, in 2010. And Montel's idea was to help inner city families really learn about healthcare, so that now that they were going to have access to insurance, to consume healthcare better. So it was a really cool idea. And he needed someone to write a business plan, so a healthcare business plan. So I did. And as I go into my presentation with him, he stops me and he says, "Phil, I don't want to be rude, but I'm going to be putting something in my mouth for about 20 minutes because I have to do my treatment." And then I said, "That's perfectly fine." So I started presenting, and he put this device in his mouth that had little wires, and you could see a discernible battery. So clearly this was not a sophisticated medical device. And so I had to stop and ask him, I said, "What the heck are you putting in your mouth?" And he started to describe how this particular device had helped relieve some of his symptoms, like neuropathic pain. That's pain that you feel in your extremities that's not due to any injury. and his balance issues that often are associated with multiple sclerosis and things like that. And being a person who sort of knows about the central nervous system because of my career in it, I knew that those things don't usually happen. So when I inquired as to why he was putting this sort of widget in his mouth, he said, "This changed my life." And I said, "Well, who invented this? Who is responsible for this?" And he pointed to this little lab at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And three very archetypical scientists in the basement of the university had toyed with this for about 20 years. So he pointed to this group of scientists at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and they'd worked on this device. And their idea was that there's a big nerve that connects the tongue to the back of the brain through what's called the trigeminal nerve. And one of them was a neurophysiologist and had remembered his basic physiology, where the tongue is actually an outcrop of the brain when you're an embryo. So he sort of did all of these things, and lo and behold, when you stimulated the tongue, it would travel along the brain, along the trigeminal nerve into the brain, and seem to put the brain into what's called a plastic state. So that means that the brain is able to receive information, and when you combine that state with physical or cognitive exercises, it seemed to allow the brain to reorganize itself to help what's been damaged by either disease or trauma. So it was rather a fantastic kind of, almost a fantasy-like description. But when I first visited them in the lab, I was lucky enough to be introduced to two patients who, both of them had a stroke and had deficits because of their stroke, and both had demonstrated how they had recovered. So that was enough for us to put together. We sort of asked them, "What do you think? We'd love to commercialize this in some way," and they were very reticent to do it. And like the old saying goes, the overnight success that took 6 months for us to ultimately negotiate. We negotiated a 50-50 joint venture where Montel, myself, and the person who introduced us was Dr. Jonathan Sakier. And we formed a company called the Neurohabilitation Corporation, which eventually became Helios when we became a public company. And the promise back to the scientists was, if we could do really solid science that would allow Health Canada and or the FDA to approve this, that we would help an enormous amount of people, and through that help and through the commercial success, help fund their research for the rest of their lives. So it was a really a match made in heaven of sort of collective expertise that sort of everyone played their role, and we built the company that way. And I had never started a company of any kind on my own. And had two really good partners. That one was a financial person, the other one was a doctor. So we said, "Oh, how tough can this be?" And we found out after 7 years that it's quite difficult, but we ultimately made it through. So very, very proud of the work that we did there.
Wow, what a fantastic story. That is just so inspiring. I love that it was your kind of inquisitive mind that just started asking questions and realizing there was a business opportunity, and you just kind of went for it. So that's the true entrepreneurial spirit we're thrilled to see.
Well, it's kind of you to say. I don't know if it was that clairvoyant, but it was certainly surprising enough to invoke curiosity. That's for sure.
Fantastic. So now you've got the patent, and you're now looking for investors to market the product. How do you take those next steps?
So this the description that I gave you, Sharon, was circa 2013 or so, and as we developed the ponds, it was not a straightforward ride. First of all, the science of doing what's called portable neuromodulation stimulator is what ultimately the technology was called. And there had never been any studies done on this. So nobody really understood how the brain and what kind of stimulation, what the dose of the stimulation should be, or any of these kinds of things. So we ended up designing a trial that was approved. In fact, we had a contract with the Department of Defense in the US because the Iraq War was just sort of in the middle of its prosecution, and a lot of soldiers were coming back with traumatic brain injury. So they were interested because there was no treatment for people who had really bad concussions. And so we partnered with them and developed the clinical trial program, but it was a little blind leading the blind scientifically. And it turns out that the stimulation was, you expect everything in life to be sort of a dose response curve. So the higher the dose, the higher it is. But it turns out that this neuromodulation through this pathway is an on-off effect. So it really didn't matter what the dose was, but that it was there. But we did a 2-year clinical trial, spent almost $30 million to develop this clinical trial. And unfortunately, the Canadian authorities looked at the data and said, "There's certainly enough here to be able to be told." And they listened to the fact that this was new science, so that was quite innovative of them. FDA took the other path and said, "We'd like you to generate more data." So this was the entrepreneurial nightmare scenario where we'd invested about $70 million in the development of this, and the company's value based on the promise of being able to help people with neurological conditions was around $500 million Canadian. And after the FDA said no, it went down to 50 million. So the subsequent loss for a lot of investors was really difficult for everyone. And now we with that learning, we sort of licked our wounds and did a new program. Ironically, for MS, the original program, because of the Army, was done for traumatic brain injury. But inspired by Montel, we did the MS program, and since MS was recognized by the U.S. as a high unmet medical need, they designated our device to be breakthrough. And that has what's called regulatory connotations, meaning that the bar for a medical device like that gets lowered a little bit, not in terms of quality of data or anything, but in terms of focus by the FDA to try and in March of this year, it finally got approved by the FDA. So that was the full circle moment for all of us. And today it is being deployed in Canada and in the US. It's deployed mostly through rehabilitation clinics. And unfortunately, because of COVID, many of the rehabilitation clinics have been at least slowed down, if not closed, for virtually the whole pandemic. So it's just now, as we're speaking, starting to make its way out into the population, and the feedback is just incredible. So it's extraordinarily gratifying to do something that ultimately helps people and ultimately could be a commercial success at the same time.
That's fantastic. Wow, what progress. It's so challenging to see change happen with neurological trauma. I have 3 friends they've had 3 major concussions, and the recovery is taking years, and each case is so unique. It must be really challenging for these clinical trials to draw conclusions over time. So that's great really that you've done that.
Thank you.
On the business side of health tech, networking is critical. You're building customers, partners, team members, and especially with all the regulation, how do you encompass or come up with your global strategy? I've got to think all the government regulations around the world is just that much more of a hurdle to get over.
Yep, so it's an excellent question, and for everyone who sort of thinks about starting a business, and students are certainly among the more starry-eyed people who say, "I'm going to start this business or that business," and it's really quite systematic, like most things in life. One of the things that I studied, I have a chemistry degree from the University of Ottawa. And it's funny, as a Canadian growing up in Canada, I at the time anyway, back in mid '80s, finishing high school and going to college was not a huge financial decision, and so we just sort of continued on, and it was just a part of your education. And I never really expected, and I'm going to get to your answer in a second, but it's important to sort of, I never expected that just because I did a chemistry degree that ultimately I was going to do chemistry. In fact, I think I went to a third year job fair and found out as an undergrad in chemistry that I could be qualified to wash pipettes in a lab, and had no desire to continue on to post or graduate work. Um, but what I've really appreciated from my science background is it allows me to be much more dispassionate and data driven, and that is such a key to business. It's such a key to because as soon as you sort of get to the emotion of this, you sort of get carried away. So I always was very disciplined in that. And when you look at developing and choosing which market you're going to exploit, you start with the data. Where and for medical stuff, certainly the U.S. is, although I think 10%, not even 5% of the world population, usually up to 30 to 50% of the world market in medtech and pharmaceuticals. So most people who want to develop medical technology ultimately have their eyes fixated on the U.S. And it's almost a no-brainer. What I did though, being a card-carrying Canadian, I've lived in the U.S. for 25 years, but when it came time to do the clinical trials, I did everything in Canada. I could hire the Neurological Institute at McGill for 70 cents on the dollar based on just the exchange. And then the university overheads in Canada were probably a third less than they were in the US. And it's not a for-profit based system. So I would, and then you take the shred credits on top of that. So I would be able to do research in Canada roughly for 35 cents on the dollar. And interestingly, many of my colleagues says, "Why do you do all your work over there?" And when I explain this to them, they go, "Holy smokes! I never realized that was the case." So I, as I start into new ventures now, pretty much all of my research I do and partner with Canadian institutions, and it's been an absolute boon. So the first is, where is the market? You'll invariably, all roads lead to the US, but there may be other places where you want to cut your teeth. In our case, we were lucky that we did a lot of the work for the ponds and helios in Canada, because it's sort of a relative anonymity, and all of the things that we did, we could make mistakes, and it's not so glaring. This was our first time through the funnel, so we certainly did make mistakes, and that's why as I enter into a second venture now, it's kind of exciting to be at an age and a time where I could learn from all of the things that I did. And finally, just to get to your answer, so everything is data driven. So you figure out what's the market, what is the regulatory environment, because medicine will always have a regulatory environment. What is where are you going to do your research? Are you going to do things on a variable cost basis versus bringing the staff in? And that's another huge dynamic. There is a wonderful infrastructure of experts, and the benefit of you're going to pay 20 or 30% profit margin for those people who provide those services, but you can buy those services punctually, in that if you need them for 3 months, great, you're going to pay again 20-30% more, but then you jettison them, and so it allows you to be a little more systematic as you build. So there's a whole bunch of strategies to use, and being in this era, it really gives you a lot of degrees of freedom to find what is best for you and what is best for the invention that you're trying to build a market, particularly in healthcare.
I love that you have built your product in the US, but you turned to Canada for your testing and in your research. You're not the first entrepreneur we've interviewed who's mentioned this, and It's just a great way to combine the cultures and your experience in both countries and bring it all together. So good for you. That is a great story. We'd love to hear that. What advice would you have given yourself in your undergraduate days?
Yeah. So the first thing, and I've used it. I have two wonderful daughters, 27 and 26. And when they were struggling and choosing what they wanted to study, one became a social worker, the other did marketing and advertising, and both were sort of fixated on, well, I'm a social worker, so I'm going to need to do social work for the rest of my life, and the same thing for my daughter who did the advertising. And I tried through my experience to say it's the same experience in how I used my science degree is to look at the set of skills that you learn when you go to school, rather than the sum of those skills, meaning a particular tight track that you're going down. So many conversations with my social worker daughter about the kinds of things that when you're a social worker. You know how to animate groups. You know how to navigate the public health system. You know what programs are available. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can open your mind to, and using the skills that you've learned through having a social work degree. And in fact, she's now parlayed that into being very interested in. She works in the North Philly area, which is a very tough area, and fell in love with the kids, and is now doing a degree in special education to combine with her degree. It's that definitely is the best advice after 35 years of is just don't be limited by what you define, what you've learned at college. There's many things that you learn, and you can apply them in many different ways. So I would continue to do that, and I have. And the beautiful part of the timing of all of this happening for me. I'm 59 years old. And figure I have one more really solid ride into me for another 5 or 6 years, and that's typically how long these things take. So the other thing is just be patient, and make sure that you learn. Everybody's sort of anxious to get to the next level and to the next step, and I don't mean level necessarily only in sort of career progression, but the next level of learning. And so many people that have worked in my organizations, although perhaps frustrating the first time they hear it, you will do more good things for your career by staying in a job a year longer. And being ready, really ready, rather than learning on the job in the next level, because of the respect that you'll garner in being able to more quickly achieve the needs or the requirements of your next position. So use the time wisely. The other is the other really important is, in such a polarizing time living in the U.S., it's just incredible, even over my 25 years in the U.S., how the sort of, it used to be, in fact, many of my best friends don't have the same political leanings as I do. And we used to have fun with that. And now it's become very, very difficult to even converse. So the other big advice is just don't blind yourself to half the world, not only politically, but scientifically, for everything. Be curious, find out try to assess a common base of facts that you can agree on. And that has everything to do with politics, but even more so in business. If you agree on a common base of facts, then you're in really good shape. And I promise not to run on a little bit more, but one of the other things that everybody always talks about in business, and that I found was a fast train to mediocrity. was this whole notion. I first became a CEO in 2002, so I've been for 19 years a CEO of 3 different businesses. And at first, I didn't know what the heck a CEO did, so I read a whole bunch of business books. And they, at the time, talked a lot about reaching consensus and getting everybody involved. And the problem with consensus is it's yielded by the lowest common denominator, and very rarely in business does a low common denominator actually have a sharp enough point to actually penetrate anything. And so, as leaders and as people at whatever stage of your career, decide what the most important lever. Everything that you're going to do is going to have either a regulatory lever or a business lever or a marketing lever or a manufacturing lever or a quality lever, whatever it is. Pick what that is. And then to the degree that you're in control of sort of managing effort, manage to where you think that biggest effort is required. So the marketing person, if manufacturing is your biggest issue, to find ways to taking cost out of manufacturing, get your marketing guy or gal to put his or her efforts in helping the manufacturing and set that as a goal. So everybody aspires to something bigger rather than everybody sort of agreeing, well, I got my little, piece of the pie here. And so that was probably the biggest lesson that I learned organically through being an organizational leader. That consensus is not a great driver of business.
That is such sound advice on so many levels. Thank you so much for that. We're hearing the experience talking right there. So that's great that you've lived it, you've seen it, and you can share it with us. All right, we'd love to end with rapid fire. We'd like to get into your mindset and understand how an entrepreneurial mind thinks. So just first answer that comes to mind. Okay. Follow rules or break rules?
Follow rules.
Most adventurous thing you've done?
Most adventurous thing I've done, get married. And been married for 35 beautiful years.
Love your honesty. Thrive in chaos or list master?
Thrive in chaos, no question.
What's the superpower you'd like to have?
I've always wanted to be able to find things at a snap of a button. So whether I'm trying to find a piece of information or whatever, if I could have a little tile that I press on my phone and say, this is where you find the information, that is my superpower for sure.
Sign me up. I want that too. Your biggest pet peeve?
People who just don't have an open mind, don't listen. It's just such a constipating, frustrating era that we live in right now. For that reason, that bugs me the most.
Yep. If you could time travel, who would you like to have coffee with the most?
Oh, Einstein, no question.
Love it. I knew it'd be a scientific answer. Which is the worst for head injuries, football or hockey?
Oh boy, you're really looking at two evils there. I'll say hockey because the speed is constant and subconcussive injuries are now proving to be as damaging as the real concussions, and it just happens more frequently in hockey.
Thank goodness for helmets. Okay, best way to keep your brain sharp?
Sleep hygiene. Go to sleep at the same time, try to wake up at the same time, drink lots of water. Those are the two things that I try to do religiously. Drives my wife absolutely batty, but once it's bedtime, it's bedtime.
That's a good one. That's a very good one. Best way to remember people's names?
Repeat them 3 times after I hear it. Subconsciously. So,
okay,
Sharon. Okay.
Okay, got it. And what do you miss most about Ottawa?
Oh boy, I don't get to miss Ottawa completely because my family still lives there, and every summer I get to spend time there. But by far, it's summer and winter in the Byward Market. The canal, the Byward Market is a blast. I went to the University of Ottawa, of course, so lived right by the Byward Market, and so that's where first place I go when I land in Ottawa.
The Byward Market has a certain smell, and I can't describe it, but when you're there, it's that unique smell. So I totally get that. Something on your bucket list.
So bucket list is for whatever reason I've traveled, lucky enough to travel all over the world, but I've never been to New Zealand, and everything I've seen or heard about New Zealand and New Zealanders. So I would like to go and spend a year there and swap houses and just go and experience that country.
Great answer. Phil, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. We totally appreciate you sharing your journey with us. We look forward to hearing more about your new endeavors, and we will talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Link, highlighting entrepreneurial paths with U Ottawa alumni and friends. If you're interested in hearing more episodes, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button wherever you might be listening. If you want to learn more about U Ottawa's Entrepreneurship Hub, the Alumni Association, or the Alumni Relations Team, visit their websites in the description of this episode. Let's link up again soon.